Well, good evening, everybody. It's 6:35. We'll get this special panel presentation started. I'd like to say welcome to everyone. There will be people that will be joining us throughout the next few minutes, I'm sure, but we've got a lot to cover. There's some incredible information. I've been privy to some of the slides, and you all are in for a treat. My name is John Thompson. I'm the CEO and founder of Community.Connect. We have programs in Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic that seek to alleviate poverty. We focus primarily on health, but also the social determinants associated with health. And so for more information on that, you can find more there at the event hub. In the chat box in a few minutes, I'll send out the link, and at the end of the presentations, we'll have a time for question and answers and a little bit of discussion. And after that, the event hub will be live where you can learn more about Community.Connect, our presenters, as well as our sponsors. We'll have virtual booths where you can find out more information from some of the sponsors that have made this special panel presentation possible. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our presenters. This is a very unique experience. In Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic, we have seen a plethora of cultural barriers, barriers of access to care, to vaccines, and we felt that it was a good opportunity to share some of the truths that are out there, as well as dispel some of the myths that we've encountered along the way. So we hope that we will be able to cover many of the challenges and solutions that will help the global community, find a way forward in the era of COVID, particularly with those with MS. So let me introduce Dr. Ben Thrower. He's a neurologist and the medical director of the Andrew C. Carlos MS Institute at Shepherd Center, Atlanta, Georgia. He attended undergraduate college at Florida State University and medical school at the University of Florida. His neurology training was at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio. And Dr. Thrower is the senior medical advisor for MS Focus and co-authored Navigating Life with MS for the American Academy of Neurology. He has been the principal investigator on over 80 clinical studies in MS. He is a clinical associate professor of neurology at the Augusta University UGA Medical Partnership. He and his pediatrician wife, Karen, serve on the board of Community.Connect and provide medical care to underserved areas of rural Nicaragua through the Together for Health program. That is a lot to say, but it only scrapes the surface of the kind of person Dr. Ben Thrower is. I'm very proud of the fact that we are friends and colleagues, and I'm happy that he'll be able to share some of his insights tonight. My newest friend is Dr. Sonia Rasmussen. She is a professor in the Department of Pediatrics, Obstetrics and Gynecology, and Epidemiology at the College of Medicine and the College of Public Health and Health Professions at the University of Florida. Dr. Rasmussen joined the University of Florida in 2018 after 20 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. While there, she served in several leadership positions, including Deputy Director of Unit responsible for planning for future pandemics and Editor-in-Chief of the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, the most frequently cited journal in epidemiology. She also served in leadership roles during several CDC responses to public health emergencies, including the 2009 H1N1 influenza, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome or MERS coronavirus, the Ebola virus, and Zika virus. She has published 20 papers on COVID-19, focusing on its effects on pregnancy and children. Dr. Rasmussen is an author of over 250 papers in the peer-reviewed literature and was the lead editor of the CDC Field Epidemiology Manual released by Oxford University Press in 2019. We are pleased to have them both tonight. We're going to hear first from Ben Thrower, and I will be running the slides. So Dr. Thrower, let me know if you'd like to go forward or backwards, and we'll
Absolutely.
start you right now.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Rasmussen, for joining us. And thank you for everyone who's joining in and our sponsors. For those of you who are not familiar with the work that Community.Connect does, please take some time after the presentation tonight to learn a bit more. Karen, my wife, and I, we've been working with Community.Connect since 2014, and I would say it has been life-changing for us. It is just a unique honor to serve the people of Nicaragua. We hope to learn more about the Dominican Republic and some of the work that's being done there as well. So what I'm going to talk first about tonight for just a few minutes is kind of a broad overview of multiple sclerosis and some of the challenges that we've had over the past year and a half with the COVID pandemic. You know, we need to start with the next slide and just kind of a 50,000 foot view of what MS is, so that we all have the kind of a level playing field. So yeah, the immunopathology of MS is that it is a relatively overactive immune system. There's a misperception at times that MS is an underactive immune system, when actually it's the opposite. So it's like most autoimmune conditions, it is an immune system that is attacking something in the human body that it should not be attacking. In the case of multiple sclerosis, the immune attack is directed against the myelin. Actually, yeah, there you go. Is directed against the myelin, the insulation, if you will, of the nerve fibers or axons in the brain and spinal cord. This micrograph picture is from a pivotal paper by Dr. Bruce Trapp at the Cleveland Clinic back in 1996 that shows the green lines there with the arrows are the areas where the myelin has been damaged. What Dr. Trapp showed definitively at that time was the little bubble there on the right-hand side. That is called a retraction bulb, and that's where the wire has actually been cut. That's axonal transection. Turns out that Dr. Jean Charcot, the famous French neurologist, father of modern neurology, had told us that MS does this back in 1868, but we somehow lost it in translation, and it wasn't until here we are, 150 plus years later that Dr. Trapp said, this is a problem, because while we can still have functioning in the central nervous system with the myelin damage, if you cut the wire or axon, there is no electrical communication across that type of damage. So this neurodegeneration and demyelination leads to progression of disability if we don't intervene. Next slide. So this is what MS looks like on MRI. And when we think about our immune therapy goals, what are we trying to do? And that's going to lead into some of the challenges that COVID has presented, because the way that COVID, that we would like to handle that, may butt heads with what we're trying to do with multiple sclerosis. So ideally, a perfect therapy in multiple sclerosis is going to prevent relapses or attacks. It's going to prevent progression of disability and prevent new lesions on MRI. Those three things together, there is an acronym that describes that: NEDA, N-E-D-A, or no evidence of disease activity. So if you achieve these three goals, you get an A+ on your MS exam. That is what we're trying to achieve with any of our therapeutic endeavors. Next slide. So when we think about where we're at now, when I finished neurology training in 1992, we had 0 FDA-approved therapies for MS. We could manage symptoms a little bit. We could talk about rehabilitation, but we really had nothing that changed the course of the disease. Now, as we're here in 2021, we have over 20 FDA-approved therapies. As we help a person with MS and their care partners select which therapy is going to be right for them, we're going to look at the convenience of the drug, the safety of the medication, the efficacy of the drug. And there's no one right path for everyone with MS, because we all have our own unique sort of risk tolerances. What we know is that with higher efficacy, we can also see higher risk. What we also have seen over the past, I would say 5 years, is the MS world sort of dividing into two therapeutic camps in the way we think about our philosophy of managing MS. Traditionally, we've talked about escalation therapy. So we're going to pick a therapy that maybe has modest efficacy, but great safety. And if the person does really well with that, we're going to leave them alone and keep them on that therapy and take advantage of that wonderful safety profile. If they don't do well, if they're not getting that NEDA or no evidence of disease activity, then we're going to move up the food chain, move them to maybe a more efficacious drug, but maybe also a therapy where there's more risk associated with it. The other competing philosophy for managing MS is called induction therapy. And with this therapeutic camp, the thought is I'm going to pick a more efficacious drug from day one. I'm going to try to manage that risk. And what drives this move towards maybe picking a more effective drug from moment one is the realization that by the time we know someone's not doing well with a given therapy, they may have accumulated disability that with our current technology, we're not able to reverse. So a lot of, I would say, pre-COVID, we were strongly moving towards the induction therapy camp and using more efficacious drugs. Next slide. So now along comes COVID-19, and I would say that it has been probably one of the biggest challenges that the MS community has faced. So what we know is that MS alone, as we said in the immunopathology slide, MS does not compromise your immune system by itself. So a person with MS really is not at higher risk for infections in general. Now, comorbidities can certainly change that equation. Diabetes, hypertension, smoking, obesity, those comorbidities may increase the risk of infections. Now, when we start modulating the immune system, we may change that equation also. So some of our more effective therapies, we do have to be mindful that we could put the person at risk for infections, including COVID-19. So some of these therapies that we have to at least be mindful of are the therapies that work on B cells in the immune system. So Ocrevus, Rituxan, Kesimpta. We have a class of drugs called S1P receptors. These are drugs that modulate how lymphocytes are able to traffic through lymph nodes. This would be Gilenya, Zeposia, Mayzent, Ponvory. And then some of our drugs that in a way you could think of as almost immune system resets, Mavenclad and Lemtrada. We want to think about the efficacy that we're getting with all of these more effective drugs, but can we manage the safety along with that better efficacy? So there's a balance between wanting to get MS treatment as effective as possible, but not compromising the immune system in a way that we're going to see issues with infections such as COVID-19. Next slide. So MS and COVID-19 vaccinations, when the vaccine started rolling out, we looked at the data for Moderna, for Pfizer, for J&J. We realized that there really were no study subjects with autoimmune conditions in any of these trials. And that's sort of the way research works. When you do clinical trials, you're looking at a type of patient that is maybe your ideal study subject, but that ideal study subject may not represent everyone in the real world. You may not have people with diabetes, hypertension, other health issues, including multiple sclerosis. So the National MS Society in early January came out with a consensus statement. They put together a panel of virologists, immunologists, epidemiologists, and said, listen, based upon what we know about MS and what we know about these vaccines, do we think these vaccines are safe for people with MS? And the consensus was yes, we feel like they're safe. Well, now fast forward to October 2021, we have hundreds of thousands of people with MS who've received these vaccinations. Here at Shepherd Center, we take care of about 3,000 individuals with MS. When I look at how my individuals with MS have responded to the vaccines, any potential side effects, they really don't look any different than the general population. And so we feel very comfortable with the safety of the vaccinations. And in general, we do recommend that people with MS pursue vaccination. How does that interact with our MS therapies? We have to realize that some MS therapies could alter vaccine effectiveness. So our specifically the B cell therapies and then our S1P therapies could decrease the humoral or antibody production that we see with these vaccines. When we look at the B cell therapies, there's good data showing that while we might affect the antibody production, it does look like the T cell activation that we see after vaccination is intact. We do have to we've always been very proactive in doing immune monitoring in patients on any of our therapies with MS. I think this COVID-19 pandemic has just re-emphasized that the necessity of being very vigilant in monitoring immune function in any of these therapies, but specifically some of our more efficacious therapies. Next slide. And then just finishing up before I turn it over to Dr. Rasmussen, one of the things that's been a bit confusing to I think our MS community and maybe to others as well is you'll hear two terms thrown out, third dose versus booster dose. And so it's not that we have different vaccines that we're using for a booster dose versus a third dose. What really separates those two terms is who's receiving it. So when we say a third dose, we're talking about someone who is potentially immunocompromised, and we're trying to give 3 doses in sequence. So that with a third dose, that third dose can be 28 days from their second dose to really try to accentuate that humoral immune response that you're getting with the vaccine. So again, third doses are for immunocompromised people, and that third dose can be given within 28 days of the second dose. Obviously, we're talking about Pfizer or Moderna. If you were talking about J&J, which is your 1-dose vaccine, in theory, that you'd be talking really about a second dose, not a third dose. Booster dose would be what someone who is not immunocompromised would receive. And so with a booster dose, you're trying to again, get that immune response kind of activated as maybe over time, it's slowly waning a little bit. A lot of sort of questions right now about how long the immune response lasts after vaccination. But right now we're thinking somewhere in the 8-month range for immunocompetent individuals to start thinking about booster doses. This is still a work in progress. As you've been following the news, probably there has been sometimes conflicting information about what's approved and what's not. Right now, technically, the Pfizer booster dose is what's approved for individuals over the age of 65. I would say in the real world, certainly a lot of people who don't fit that category are doing booster doses. My wife and I have already done our third doses of Moderna just because when we thought about the risk-benefit ratio, we thought it was smarter to do it. And we're in an occupation where we might have more potential exposure. So that kind of sets the big picture of where we're at and some of the challenges we've faced with multiple sclerosis and COVID. I think now we'll turn it over to Dr. Rasmussen and to kind of talk a little bit more about some specific patient populations with and vaccinations and dispelling some of the myths that we've seen out there that have discouraged people from pursuing vaccination.
Great. Thank you so much. Next slide. I thought it would be helpful to show where we're at in this pandemic. So first of all, you can see that we've had, remember the first wave in March where everything shut down, then second wave, then the third wave around the holidays. And then we really just have, in most places, have peaked after our fourth wave. So you can see our numbers are starting to come down. We really thought this summer that things were getting better and that we were hopefully seeing the end of this pandemic. What happened to change that? It really was the Delta variant. So next slide. So the orange in this picture shows the kinds of variants. So we know viruses change all the time. That's what they do. They change just, they're basically misspelling errors, and some of the misspelling errors make the virus less able to transmit, but some make them more able to transmit, and that's what's happened with the Delta variant. You can see at the beginning of this graph, in June and July, you can see that there wasn't as much Delta variant. Then now everything is the Delta variant that's out there. And the Delta variant is really more transmissible. And that's why it's been able to take over of all the other variants. Next slide. So what is the Delta variant? As I said, viruses mutate, they change as they spread, and the more they spread, the more they're going to mutate. And that's one of the reasons why vaccination is so important, to stop the spread so that we can stop more mutations, because the Delta variant might not be the end of these mutations. There might be another variant that comes along that could be even more transmissible or more severe. So the Delta variant appears to be more than twice as contagious. So previously, if you look on the right side of the slide, we thought the original virus from Wuhan, one person on average gave that virus to 2 people. Well, with the Delta variant, one person on average gives that virus to 5 to 8 people. That's what is called the R0, or the reproduction number. So you can imagine if one person gives it to, say, 6 people, then those 6 people give it to 6 more. Those 36 people each give it to 6 more. You can see how quickly you can have exponential spread. And that's really what's happened. Is the Delta variant causing more severe illness? There's lots of questions about that right now. I think the data suggests to me that it's true, but I don't think that's definitive, but it sure looks like it's causing more severe disease. Certainly we're seeing a lot more severe disease in kids in our hospitals in Florida. Unvaccinated people are at the highest risk, although we now know that fully vaccinated people, so you get your vaccine, you think, I'm never gonna get the virus, and that was what some people thought, but we're learning now that Delta variant can get into your nose. It probably isn't going to make you sick, and you're probably not going to end up in the hospital if you're vaccinated, unless you don't have a completely normal immune system, but you could have it in your nose and you could potentially spread to others. That's why the decision was made to recommend that people start wearing masks again when they're indoors. Next slide, even if they're vaccinated. So we know that there are now 3 vaccines that are available in the United States. You can see the first one, the Pfizer vaccine, has received full approval, and the other 2 are under emergency use authorization. To be honest, I'm not sure that there's a huge amount of difference. The data that are clear from both things, with the data that are submitted, are a lot of similarities, and these vaccines have been held to a very high standard because they're going to be given to healthy people versus treatments that are given to somebody that's already sick. So you can see that the first 2, the Pfizer and the Moderna, are mRNA vaccines. They're given 2 doses, one's 3 weeks apart, the other's 4 weeks apart, and they both, in those original clinical trials, were really very effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19, 95, 94%. You can see that the Pfizer is for people 12 years of age and above, and the Moderna is 18 years of age and above. And then the Janssen or Johnson & Johnson is under EUA. That's a single dose, and that's a viral vector. So basically you're giving a little tiny piece of the genetic material of that virus, of SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19 in a viral vector. So, and you can see those numbers in the clinical trial were a little bit lower. It's important to remember, though, that was during the later, when there were more variants, where Moderna and Pfizer were both tested with when fewer variants were around. Next slide. So how are we doing with vaccination? Well, remember early on in December, where people were fighting to get the vaccine, who got it next? People were hovering over their browser trying to get an appointment to get the vaccine. At that time, I was getting a lot of calls about, was there ways that I could help people get a vaccine sooner? And of course, we went up and up and up and up, and then really started dropping off. So many people were initially saying, well, I want to wait and see. It's a brand new vaccine. I want to wait and see. Now we are trying to encourage people to get vaccinated. And I think we're really fighting against, and this is what I'm going to talk about at the end, is we're really fighting against a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's out there. And I want to give you some information to fight some of that with us, because it's been a real challenge. You can see that we had sort of an increase recently, and then kind of leveling off again. I expect that with some of the vaccine mandates, we're going to see an increase again. Next slide. So what do we know about COVID-19 vaccines and the Delta variant? We know that people that are fully vaccinated are less likely to get infected, even to have a virus in their nose. And it appears that unvaccinated people are about 5 times more likely to get infected than people that are vaccinated. But we do know breakthrough infections can occur. We know that there's some studies, and this is not entirely consistent. There's some studies that show that the virus that's in your nose in a fully vaccinated person is similar to that of a person that's unvaccinated, but there's some other studies that show that actually it's a little bit lower in people that are fully vaccinated. It's interesting, though, it looks like people who are vaccinated, they have the virus in their nose and then it drops off really quickly, where of course, people who are unvaccinated, it kind of sticks around for a while. But the good news is that we're learning that COVID-19 vaccines remain highly protective against severe disease, hospitalizations and deaths. So you see on the slide here, this is from the CDC MMWR, unvaccinated people have, in this study, it was 29 times more likely to be hospitalized than people that are fully vaccinated. This is one study. The studies are fairly consistent that at least 10 times more likely to be hospitalized and to die if you're unvaccinated versus if you're vaccinated. Next slide. So the vaccines are still, even with Delta, are working against severe disease. So now you've heard a little bit about this additional doses and boosters. So I'm glad that Dr. Thrower's already explained to you those differences, because I think that's one of the things, third dose versus boosters has been really confusing to people. And what we're thinking is for people that are immunocompromised, that third dose is needed to just get them on the same ballpark as everybody else. So that really is like they need a 3-dose series of the Pfizer or Moderna, where everybody else initially was thought to only need 2. Next slide. So this is about the additional doses of COVID-19 vaccine for immunocompromised people. This decision was made, I guess, about a month ago. It's hard to keep up with all these dates, maybe 2 months ago. But what it showed was that people who have moderate to severe immunocompromise don't have the same level of immunity after vaccination and therefore may benefit from an additional dose. And so this is the recommendations for people that meet that. You know, CDC did come up with some recommendations of people that meet that, but really it came down to whether your healthcare provider believes that you need it or not, so that there could be some individualization. Next slide. So what about boosters? And of course, there's been so much confusing information in the news about boosters, you know, and there was an announcement that boosters for everybody after September 21st. And then there was, you know, the politics doesn't make those decisions, is the bottom line. The decisions are made by scientists. And so the FDA did vote against blanket recommendations. They said specific groups need COVID-19 vaccine boosters, but not everybody. Then these decisions go from FDA, then they go to the CDC, and CDC made some recommendations of who should get boosters. And actually the CDC director then overruled one little piece of those recommendations. So I'll go through just briefly where we're at now, so you know where we're at now, because I won't step you through all these processes of the government. It might be a little more than everybody needs to know. So next slide. So everything about boosters is just like when we're thinking about vaccines in the first place. Everything is, are the benefits of the vaccine greater than the potential risks? So, you know, I do a lot of work with kids and with pregnant women, and that's what it's about with kids and pregnant women. We know, for example, pregnant persons are at increased risk of severe disease for COVID-19. So even you have to say, well, then the benefits of getting a vaccine are going to be even more than somebody who's not pregnant. For kids, soon we're going to be looking at the data for 5 to 11-year-olds. As you know, Pfizer has submitted those data to the FDA, and they're going to be reviewed on October 26th. Kids don't get as sick. So we're going to have to be looking at, are the benefits of the vaccine for kids worth, well, we know very small risks, but there are risks of vaccine. Anytime you do anything, when you step out the door of your house, you take a risk. So you have to weigh those benefits and risks, and that's what they were doing for the boosters. Next slide. So our booster dose is needed. This is some of the information that the CDC reviewed, and they tried to look at different populations. It's clear that people over 65 years of age, not only are they getting more virus in their nose, but they are starting to even have more hospitalization. Greater for Pfizer than Moderna. It looks like Moderna has longer lasting effect. And as you may know, Moderna, the dose of Moderna was a lot higher, was substantially higher. So even in the Delta variant predominant period, it looks like Moderna is continuing to provide good protection. As you know, in the next few days, I think it's next week, the FDA is going to be looking at the Moderna data. But there is evidence of waning immunity in the Delta variant predominant period for people that are 65 years of age and older. The bottom line for underlying conditions, the right studies really haven't been done. There's really no data on infection. It looks like there's still, if you have an underlying condition, there's still fairly good protection for you against hospitalization. And then what about those people that are in high risk of exposure? What about doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists and other people who are taking care of patients with COVID. There really aren't any data, again, about hospitalization. And it seems like there's similar patterns for infection, that infection does seem to be increasing. And so you really don't want your doctor or your nurse to have a bunch of virus in your nose. So it's not only the risk to the doctor or nurse, okay, maybe they aren't going to get that sick, but you don't want them spreading it to patients that they're seeing either. Next slide. So our booster dose is safe. So that's the other thing. We got to look at the risks versus the benefits. And so what are the risks? Well, we know the data from vaccines. These vaccines are remarkably safe, and there have been, and I'm going to show you in a couple minutes, the kinds of things that are 1 in a million or a little more than that, 3 in a million, but very rare sorts of serious effects. And that seems to be the same thing when people have gotten boosters. It seems like the data that are available, there are people from in a clinical trial that Pfizer conducted that have gotten boosters. There are people that have chosen to get their own boosters and that have signed up through CDC to give their information. And there are some people in Israel. Israel's a little bit ahead of us with their vaccine. They had a much broader uptake of vaccine, and therefore they've already started getting booster doses. And what's been shown is that the boosters seem to be really safe. And I think that would be expected, although, you know, there's always a concern that maybe the third dose could cause some problems. That's not what's been seen. What's been seen is that the effects of the third dose seem to be similar to dose 2. Next slide. So this is just, and boy, this turned out kind of small, sorry about that. But I just want to show here the safety signals that have come up. So these vaccines are the most carefully studied vaccines that have ever been out there. So people are looking really carefully. There are several systems at the FDA and at the CDC and some groups and academics that are funded by the CDC to look at risk factors for these vaccines. What they found is there are some risks, just like every medication that you take. So just starting at the bottom with Johnson & Johnson, and if you look at the line with safety signals, there is some risk of Guillain-Barré. It's small, but 7 to 8 cases per million doses. The stroke-like episodes that have the low platelets, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, that is about 3 cases per million doses. Each of these have a risk factor for a specific age group. So the thrombosis with thrombocytopenia, that stroke-like thing, is highest risk for females 30 to 49. For Guillain-Barré, it's for older people. Highest risk is males 50 to 64. And then if you look at the 2 mRNA vaccines, that we haven't seen the stroke-like episodes, we haven't seen Guillain-Barré, but what has been seen is myocarditis. Interesting, this is milder than typical myocarditis that we see. Typically, when we see myocarditis in the pediatric population, it can be pretty severe. What's been seen in these patients that have post-vaccine myocarditis is it tends to be something that's pretty easily treated, and they seem to do well long-term. And this is the highest risk is in males 18 to 29 years of age. And you can see it's about 3.5 cases per million for the second doses. It seems to occur more after the second dose than the first. So really very low risk, but there are some risks, and I don't like to pretend that there aren't some risks. So next slide. So who needs a Pfizer booster? This is something from CDC, and I think it's a nice quick look of who needs boosters right now. First of all, it's right now, as of what is today, whatever today is, October 12th, I don't even know anymore. But it's just for people who've gotten the Pfizer vaccine. I think very soon we'll have recommendations about Moderna. There was some data released today. And I think an FDA, as I said, is meeting next week about that. And after that, CDC will meet. So our CDC advisory committee will meet. So who should get a booster shot? People who are 65 years of age and older, people who are 50 years and older with underlying conditions, and then people who live in a long-term care setting like a nursing home. Who may get a booster shot? So these are people that it's not so clear that they really have to have it, but if they want to get it, they can. It's 18 to 49 years with certain medical conditions like heart disease or diabetes, and then 18 to 64-year-old people who are at increased risk of exposures because of where they work or because of where they live. So as you know, many healthcare workers and teachers and so on are recommended, are in that category. Next slide. So what's next? So FDA has scheduled, so there's an FDA, I know this is maybe a little too much for someone that's not in the government, but I think it's important for people when you hear it on the news. A lot of my friends, my medical student friends were saying, oh, FDA approved it, I can get it tomorrow. I was like, no, you got to wait for CDC. So there's FDA, then CDC. Each of them has advisory committees that meet, and then actually FDA can overrule their advisory committee. CDC can overrule their advisory committee, as what was seen recently. So FDA has 3 meetings scheduled. They have a meeting scheduled on October 14th to look at the booster dose for Moderna. What's in the news is that the company is asking for a booster dose that's half the dose. They don't think you need a full dose. October 15th is a booster dose discussion of a booster dose for COVID-19. And they're also going to talk about mix and match. Like if you got Pfizer first, is it okay to get Moderna second? If you got Moderna second, is it okay to get Pfizer? If you got Johnson & Johnson, is it okay to get one of the mRNA vaccines? And then finally, CDC has scheduled meetings of its advisory committee on immunization practices on October 20th and 21st, and then November 2nd and 3rd. November 2nd and 3rd, as a pediatrician, we're all waiting with very anxiously, because that's when they're going to talk about kids. So I don't know, do we have time to talk about the myths? Do you want to leave time for questions?
John, I think the myth part's important.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
Well,
we
I'll
have
try to
time.
go through the myths quickly. So I don't want to go on and on, but I'll go through some of the myths. So this has been a really big issue in this response, that and I think social media makes a difference. I like social media. I like staying in touch with my friends from high school and medical school and so on. But social media allows misinformation or disinformation to get around very quickly. And this is a quote. Some people say it's Winston Churchill, but what I found is it was this guy, Cordell Hull, that worked with Franklin Roosevelt. A lie will gallop halfway around the world before the truth has time to pull its breeches on. And this was way before social media. Next slide. So why should I get a vaccine? It doesn't work anyway. Well, hopefully you've heard today, it may not keep you from having virus in your nose, but it will. If you have a normal immune system, it is very likely to keep you from having severe disease, hospitalization, and death. So I think that's the good news. Next slide. And here you can see, these are data just from University of Florida. You can see red are people who were not vaccinated that were in our hospital, and green are people who were vaccinated. So you can see the people who were vaccinated, unvaccinated, way outweighs the people who are unvaccinated. Next slide. mRNA vaccines are actually gene therapy, not vaccines. And I'm a geneticist. They're not gene therapy. They can't change your DNA. In fact, the mRNA vaccines can't even enter your nucleus. They go straight to the ribosomes, and they start making that little piece of spike protein. That spike protein goes outside of your cells, and your immune system recognizes them. And if you have any questions about the immune system, you're gonna have to go to Dr. Thrower. But so then the DNA adenovirus used by Johnson & Johnson does enter the nucleus, but it doesn't have the enzyme needed to integrate into our chromosomes. So it just quickly makes it into mRNA and it goes away. So this is not gene therapy. And you can see, I include some of the tweets. Twitter's been really bad for some of this misinformation. You're not anti-vaccine, you're anti-human gene therapy. So it is not gene therapy. Next slide. So this one, I'm not sure why Bill Gates would want to know where I was at all the time, but if he wanted to know, he just needs to look at my phone, right? So this one is COVID vaccines do not contain microchips. Vaccines work by stimulating your immune system to make antibodies, just like if you were exposed to the disease, but without getting that risk of dying by being exposed to the disease. You get immunity without having to get the disease first. Next slide. So this is one that I see on a lot of the websites, a lot of the Twitter and Facebook posts. Look at all those deaths in VAERS. Well, VAERS is one of CDC's ways of looking at vaccine safety. And what they do is anybody can report to VAERS. I could report to VAERS today to say I had I had a thumbnail or a hangnail after I had the vaccine. Anything can be reported there. And of course, people die every day. And sometimes people might die after the vaccine. What CDC and FDA do is when there's an adverse event, they contact the doctor that took care of the patient and try to see if there's any evidence at all that it's related to if that death or that adverse event is related to the person getting the vaccine. So just because something's reported of errors following vaccination doesn't mean that the vaccine caused any sort of health problem. CDC does have some other studies. I mentioned that there are some universities that are working with CDC and FDA to try to follow up on those, to try to really figure out, is it causative or not? Next slide. So as I mentioned before, there are some risks of vaccines, but they're very small, in that range of 3 per million, 7 per million, that sort of thing. Next slide. COVID vaccines were rushed. They didn't go through the usual approval process. The mRNA vaccines are based on a new technology, but that technology was at least 10 years in the making. And the billions of dollars went into the government, our tax dollars. Our government realized that the damage that COVID-19 was doing to our economy and to with illness and to society. And because of that, lots of tax dollars were used to cover Operation Warp Speed, which made it for these vaccines to be made and tested. But there were the full randomized controlled clinical trials that are done with any vaccine. They were performed and they showed the vaccines are safe and effective. And they also went through all those levels, and you're seeing every time I hear people saying, why can't they hurry up and get that vaccine for kids out? I have to say, personally, for me, I want a vaccine for kids 5 to 11 years old, but I want it to go through the process. So I want it to go through the FDA Advisory Committee, which any of you can watch that. It's a live stream. I've watched every one of them. And then the CDC Advisory Committee meeting is also online live streamed. You can watch that too. You might say it's a little bit like watching golf, but anyway, they're not the most exciting meetings, but you can watch them and you can see people arguing one side and the other. I think that's helpful to me to realize this isn't something that someone has come in with a done deal because somebody already made the statement that everybody's going to get boosters. Those scientists are making their own decisions and everyone's watching them. Next slide. So all of the phases in the clinical trials for vaccines that were done before COVID-19, these vaccines went through that. Next slide. And why did it happen so fast? Well, one thing, as I said, the mRNA technologies were pretty far along. It was one of the things that people working on some of these new technologies were preparing. We were preparing for a pandemic for a long time, but we were preparing for an influenza pandemic, not a COVID pandemic. But a lot of these technologies were in place for an influenza pandemic. Also, they used clinical trial networks that were already in place. So they didn't need to recruit new clinicians, new nurses, new everybody, new investigators. The manufacturing began while the clinical trials were still underway. So normally, if you're a vaccine company, you're going to say, I want to be darn sure that works before I put a bunch of money in to make it and put it in the little glass vials and everything. But because our tax dollars, lots of our tax dollars were put into this, they were able to start making vaccine before it was shown it was going to work. And they were going to have to throw that away if it didn't work. Fortunately, they worked, so they were able to do that. mRNA vaccines are a way to produce large amounts of vaccine quickly. And that's something that's going to be on our side if we get a variant that is so different that the vaccines don't cover it, because we're going to be able to put a new cassette in there, a new little piece of RNA that can make vaccine quickly. FDA and CDC prioritized review and authorization of those COVID-19 vaccines. And I know you may remember that the FDA, the first authorization was right a little bit after Thanksgiving. And I hear some of that my colleagues that work at FDA saying everybody was eating turkey sandwiches on Thanksgiving because they were reviewing the trials. Next slide. So everybody's pulled out the stops for this. So this next one, vaccines have shown to make you magnetic. The vaccine does not make you magnetic. They don't include anything that will make an electromagnetic field. All these vaccines are free from metals. And there's some of the comments that somebody testified in Ohio about the magnetism, but it's not magnetic. Next slide. COVID-19 vaccines can give you COVID-19. We hear this every year with the flu vaccine. So I'm not sure anybody's going to believe me anymore for COVID-19 than they do for flu. But this is really different. These are vaccines that are giving you that genetic material. Never are you getting the virus. So with other vaccines in the past, sometimes you got a killed virus or you got an attenuated virus that was live, but it was milder. That's, for example, the MMR vaccine. But that's not true for COVID-19 vaccines. You're getting a message it's sort of like getting a recipe. Somebody's sending you the recipe to make it, but you're not getting the COVID-19 virus, not even a killed virus. And so it's not possible to shed the virus. It's not containing a live virus. It cannot give you COVID-19. Next slide. Do vaccines cause infertility or sterility? And all of you probably heard about Nicki Minaj and her cousin who had swollen testicles. And obviously this is one of the things that's really concerning. This was something that got very widely spread, and people who might have been thinking about the vaccine became concerned about this. This is another thing that there's absolutely no truth to. Next slide. So initially, one of the concerns was that it made it so you couldn't get pregnant. Of course, that was the case. People might be using it for birth control, but it does not work that way. So, I thought this was interesting. There's an immunologist that said, yeah, there are some similarities between the coronavirus spike and the placental protein, but and I like to see, I wrote it in red, mixing them up would be akin to mistaking a rhinoceros for a jaguar because they're wearing the same collar. So they really are very different. So next slide. And I'm going to show you this next slide, I think really shows, I know people when they're trying to get pregnant, all you can think of is you want to get pregnant. But what happened even in the vaccine trials where people were told don't get pregnant because we don't know what the effects are during pregnancy. They didn't know. Now we have a lot of data, but at that time they didn't know. Even in that, you can see how many pregnancies occurred in the vaccinated group and very similar numbers to what occurred in the control group. So these were people that were told, don't get pregnant, please be on birth control. And you can see a lot of people got pregnant. So I think we have very good data now that show that it does not cause sterility or infertility. Next slide. So how do we deal with this vaccine hesitancy? And this is some advice from the American Medical Association. One of the things is people don't want to hear 95% or 66%. They want to hear stories. They want to hear you say, I wondered about that too, but I really looked at the data and I decided to get myself vaccinated, and I decided to get my kids vaccinated, and I decided to get my elderly parents vaccinated. They want to hear that. Or they want to hear, well, yeah, my sister got vaccinated and she was pregnant and she's had a wonderfully normal baby. You might say, well, that's anecdotal, but for a lot of patients, that is more helpful than spouting a bunch of numbers, as all of us tend to do. So one of the other things is ask what they've heard, because lots of times people have heard something that you might not even think to address. Another thing is don't repeat the myth. And of course I did that here, but I'm hoping that you guys won't do that. Don't say, now I need to address the myth about infertility and sterility. Don't say that. You can say, we know that it doesn't cause infertility and sterility, but don't repeat the myth first. Because sometimes there's been some studies that have shown all people remember is the myth. And then finally, the remain calm and communicate. And it's really hard to do that sometimes when people are I've had hate emails, I've had hate Twitter, and it's really hard to remain calm, but I have to keep reminding myself that these are people that have been given information from what they think is a trusted source, and it's not a trusted source, and I want to give them the best information I can. And remember, people want to hear it from healthcare providers. All the studies that I've looked at have said people want to hear it. The other thing is they want to hear that you've gotten the vaccine. So one of the other studies is that has shown people make a decision if they say, well, my friends have all gotten vaccinated and they did fine. So even if you're not a healthcare provider, telling people that you got the vaccine is helpful, so that people know that you thought it was a good idea. So anyway, sorry I took so long. I think that's it. So this is my email if anybody has any questions that we can't answer tonight.
That was fantastic. Thank you both for sharing. There's a few questions that have come in the remaining time that we have. I'm not sure if you can see them. So let me go. There were a couple here. I think one is specific to MS. Should patients with MS get booster dependent on MS therapy or comorbidities?
So there are a lot of variables that go into that. So if you are on one of a potential immune suppressant drug, so that you would be in that immunocompromised class, yes, we would want you to think about an additional dose. If you are not in an immunocompromised class, then we're going to have that booster dose discussion. And again, that's going to depend upon all the things that Dr. Rasmussen just said, so age, comorbidities, occupation, potential risk. So there are a lot of variables. And so we sent out a kind of a blanket letter to all of our patients, but then we've had a lot of individual conversations with them saying that, we couldn't possibly cover every permutation of individual situations out there. So yeah, for the MS population, it's important to think about what drug they're on, what occupation or risk they have, and what age are they.
I see the next question is about seasonality dynamics. Like, is it the winter worse than the summer? I think it really depends on where you live. Being inside in closed areas that aren't well ventilated is what the risk is. So, where people in the north now are starting to be spending a lot more time inside, we in the South are finally getting out of the air conditioning. So, where it's been so hot here, now it really is possible to spend more time outside, eat outside, and not feel like you're sweating in your food, that kind of thing. So I think it depends on where you're at. There's no question that being inside is a risk, and especially being inside without a mask is a risk. So I think we're going to see different seasonality in different places. I think in the north, we are going to see some worsening unless those areas get high enough vaccination rates that they can dampen that down. What do you think of a risk of another variant wave spreading globally? That really, I think, is what worries all of us. We know that we can say, well, we're not doing a great job in the United States, but much of the world hasn't even gotten their healthcare providers vaccinated yet. And that, of course, is a big concern. And it's a big concern for a variant, because the more that virus replicates, the more chance of a variant coming that can spread quickly, like what we've seen with Delta, but we know it could always get worse, unfortunately. And then how does the drug pipeline look for those without vaccines? I think that there is some good news lately about medications. I think one thing to remind people who say they don't want to get the vaccine because it's experimental, those drugs are really experimental. The vaccines have now been given to, 200, 300 million people in the United States, I guess about 200 and some million people in the United States, and with lots of good safety data. Keep in mind, those medications have not been studied as much. So if you don't like experimental medications and vaccines, I think you're a lot safer with the vaccine than you are with one of these new medications. But of course, if you're sick, those medications are what you need. And I think some of them are looking pretty promising based on the data that are available right now. So.
Dr. Rasmussen, what do you think about the possibility of an intranasal vaccination? Do you think we would generate a bigger antibody repertoire, and it's something that looks more like a natural infection with an intranasal form?
Yeah, there's been some discussion of that. And yesterday I heard a study that says actually there is some, with the mRNA vaccines, there is some IgA, secretory IgA, as I said, you're the immune expert, not me. But there is some IgA that's being produced, so that it's not as much as we thought that it would be all just IgM and IgG in your blood. So, but the hard thing is, how do you test an intranasal vaccine? Do you do it on someone that has refused to get another vaccine? Because really standard of care right now, no IRB is going to say, well, let's give you a placebo and give you an intranasal vaccine, because they're going to say that would be unethical. So it's going to be hard to study those intranasal vaccines. But I guess if it's someone who's refusing to get a needle, but would get intranasal, you could do a randomized controlled trial that way.
Well, we're right at time, but we have Dr. Rasmussen's contact information here on the screen. If you have any further questions, also you can contact Community.Connect at info@community.connect.org. I'll put contact information in the chat box for everyone to see. There's also, I wanted to thank our presenters. You're incredible people doing incredible work. I'm just in awe of the information that you shared, and really appreciate you taking the time to share with our community, you know, this information, dispel some of the myths that I hear all the time from my own friends. And this gives me some ammo to talk to them and say, hey, I got it from the sources. So really can't thank you enough for your time, and also all those that are attending. We have somebody that raised their hand. Let me see if Adrian Morphy. Adrian, I'll get your question to our presenters, because I can't see you otherwise. But what I will direct everybody to do is to check out our event hub. In the chat box, the first message there has a link to our event hub, and that's where you can find more information about Community.Connect. It's where you can find more information about our presenters and also our sponsors, Biogen, Genzyme, Alexion, Horizon, Genentech, and Bristol Myers Squibb, who made this panel presentation possible. So without further ado, again, I thank our presenters and everyone who was in attendance tonight. Thank you for your time and participation. And let's be in touch, and we'll let you know when we do another panel presentation in the future. Presenters, do you have any last comments or anything else to add?
John, thank you for helping put this together. Hopefully this will be the first of many.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be part of it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay, well, I'll leave the webinar going. You guys can sign off, but I'm gonna leave the slide up also so people can access the link to the event hub. So have a wonderful rest of your evening, and thank you once again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.